Αγαπητές φίλες και φίλοι,
Dear friends, good afternoon, and welcome to the annual lecture in the memory of Nicos Poulantzas. We are starting with a slight delay today because, as you all have observed, I suppose, the situation outside on the roads is a little bit difficult, and many people found it difficult to come to the venue. They're still coming, in fact, as far as I see, but I believe that since we've waited for more than a quarter of an hour, half an hour, in fact, we may as well commence. It is a great pleasure for the members and the partners of the Nicos Poulantzas Institute and myself personally to be welcoming today the comrade, the colleague, the great thinker, Lynne Segal, who will be delivering the annual lecture.
intellectual, great pleasure to welcome you here at the Institute Nicos Poulantzas to give the annual lecture in memory of Nicos Poulantzas. Η ετήσια διάλεξη στην αριστερή δημόσια σφαίρα. Η πρώτη έγινε το 2000.
The annual lecture is a tradition for the left public sphere. The first one took place in the year 2007. Today, we'll be attending the 17th lecture. We do hope and trust that this tradition will go on in the future. We'll see that our institute has invited top thinkers and intellectuals from different scientific fields, disciplines, and currents of left thinking. We aspire to accommodate, listen to, and discuss with the great thinkers, the ones whose work we read, bringing the Greek public in contact with the left theoretical and political discourse. The left is thinking in practice. The annual lecture, in the name of one of the greatest Greek left thinkers, aspires to acquaint us with schools of thought, theoretical and scientific directions that can help the left shape policies, strategies, and a vision for our country. Let me mention Channel 2. Well, let me mention a few from our previous speakers. Leo Panich, who left us recently, Judith Patrick, Gadiatri Spivak, Enzo Traverso, Wendy Brown, Angela Davis, Manuel Costells, Konstantinos Tsoukalas. Last year, we celebrated our 25-year anniversary since the creation of our institute. I believe that we are acquainted with the big contribution of the directors, the researchers, and all the staff working for the left and Greek intellect, generally speaking. These difficult days, I would like to emphasize that according to our Articles of Association, the character of our institute as a body, an organization for the research of political, theoretical, and ideological matters of our country makes it a necessity for the Nicos Poulantzas Institute to ring-fence the autonomy of its operation and the responsibility of independence in its work. These are the very words written in our Articles of Association. The Institute has safeguarded throughout its 25 years of operation its autonomy and independence as the apple of its eye. And of course, the same thing applies with the political organization that funds it. We'll continue this course, the one described in our Articles of Association, if this is permitted in the near future, and we'll know that relatively soon, I suppose. Let me dwell on today's speaker. If there is one comment to make that befits the multi-annual socialist combative life of Lynne, is that of troublemaker. She is a troublemaker for all intents and purposes. The title of her book, Making Trouble, Life and Politics, is, in my opinion, the best title that we can attribute to her fight, her teaching, and her life. Lynne has been fighting her whole life in order to bridge, rather, optimism and belief in women's liberation of the 60s and 70s with the difficult days of the 21st century. Optimism has disappeared. Times have turned bleak, as is the title of a book recently published by our institute. Time has decayed. The left is on the defense because different rights have prevailed politically in Europe, and now they aspire to achieve full ideological hegemony, and they're waiting for the debacle of the left. The Red Lion Square or May movement of the same time, more or less, were replaced by leaving the public space, thinking only as a private actor, and by fighting but only locally, have the promise of social emancipation remains topical and urgent. It is precisely to this that Lynne has dedicated her entire life with zeal, enthusiasm, and optimism, and we really need all those qualities today. Lynne came to London from Sydney, Australia, in the year 1970. She had finished her studies in psychology there. She was an active member of a libertarian organization, many features of which have survived in her work in movements and politics. Her academic career started at the University of Middlesex. In the year 2000, she joined Birkbeck, the radical college of the University of London, which is celebrating this year its 200 years since its establishment. I was a member of the committee that selected Lynne, and I can assure you that our enthusiasm was beyond words when we saw her name amidst hundreds of candidates for the so-called anniversary chairs. Chairs to celebrate back then the 175 years of life of this university. The university where she teaches at night, people work in London, giving them full degrees from the University of London. Lynne played a pivotal role in the establishment of the innovative Department of Psychosocial Studies in the year 2007. This department and the School of Jurisprudence, established early in 1972, constitute the two progressive faculties of our university. They are acknowledged as centers of critical teaching, learning, and research. For 60 years, Lynne has been living in a big Victorian house in Islington, in the north of London. This house, in fact, was a socialist feminist commune. It was a communal, it was a center for movement, initiatives, and resistance. In the year 1983, Lynne joined the Labour Party, and her house was turned into an election center for the election of Jeremy Corbyn, who was elected as an MP the first time. This survived until 1990, but the house, a truly amazing house in the north of London, is still boisterous with political and theoretical life. The summer party Lynne throws constitutes one of the top events that are indeed very important in the calendar of the left and intellectual life of London. You'll find there thinkers, artists, activists, politicians, building the political and progressive identity of our times. Lynne's biography, in fact, should be turned into a song. It's worth it, and it should be sung by Gloria Gaynor. This is what a journalist, in fact, said, and I believe that she is absolutely right. But let us examine how it is that Lynne stirred the waters and changed course in the many, many different domains she delved into. Feminism. Lynne was a central movement member in the first wave of feminism, which was an optimistic feminism. It was imaginative, it was comprehensive, it resisted sexism, bigotry, patriarchy, and it accepted all forms of female sexual expression, looking for an impressive ensemble of gender strategies. In 1994, she published Straight Sex, Rethinking the Politics of Pleasure. She disavowed the extreme positions of the second generation of feminism, and she turned to the sexual liberation movement of the 60s with self-confidence and optimism that were part and parcel of that thinking. Men are not the enemy. Straight women should not feel guilty guilty of their desires. This is the permanent leitmotif in her work. The book, White Feminism, supports a dynamic feminism that is becoming a movement for transformation, capable of liberating both genders from the tyranny of labor, fear, commercialization, exploitation. These theoretical positions inspire her other book, Straight Sex, the one that I mentioned before, The Politics of Pleasure. Lynne deconstructs the opinions whereby men are active and women are passive, an opinion that supports heteronormalcy and promotes the discourse and practices of male domination. The common message of these books is the changeable fluidity of gender and sexual experience. Common lesson, the rejection of the idea that human nature is predefined, predetermined. Humanity writes its history in its own right. We need a comprehensive left feminism struggling for a more equitable, fair, and compassionate world. Together with Shelley Robotham and Hilary Wainwright, other historic figures of feminism and socialism in England, in 1979, wrote the booklet entitled Beyond the Fragments, an important political manifesto. In the early 80s, the left, beyond the Labour Party, was politically and ideologically divided, but it was on the rise nevertheless. And at that time, people of the left attacked people of the left, despite the fact that Thatcher's right was on the rise as well. The Beyond the Fragments book supports the opinion that feminists, feminist men and women, people of the left and trade unionists need to coordinate their struggles, contributed to the dynamics expressed back then. Perhaps some of you may remember or may have heard Greater London Council under the gifted leader Kevin Livingstone, Red Ken as he was called. GLC, as we referred to it back then, was the only significant and effective rival of Madame Thatcher. And just because Madame Thatcher could not do anything to contain it, she did away with it. And London is the only big city in the world that doesn't have one municipality. It has 32 smaller ones, but not a greater council. And Lynne and the women that worked with her were central figures in the theoretical organization around the Greater London Council, and of course, many of them, women and men, worked in London. Socialism, the socialist and feminist Lynne acknowledges the relations of power between men and women with the roles. However, male domination, she claims, is not a direct outcome of the relations of production, but it is inextricably related to order, the organization of production and reproduction, the sovereign ideology and culture, class, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, divide men and women, many systems of power, many joints of power traverse and define a capitalist society. The struggle against them needs to be coordinated. A feminism that does not comprise class and racial oppression as a target is doomed to fail. The same thing applies to a socialism that does nothing to tackle with women's oppression.
Lynne is a cosmopolitan Jew, a dynamic feminist and socialist, and has been dedicated to internationalism and pacifism. Palestine is the big trauma, making Lynne shudder and leading her fights and struggles. In the past 20 years, through the deterioration of life in the occupied territories of Palestine, Lynne is mobilized with organizations promoting the cooperation between progressive Palestinians and Israelis, such as the Jews for Justice for Palestinians, Faculty for Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and the Independent Jewish Voices that had organized conferences at the University of London trying to introduce human rights in the Palestine conflict. So Lynne actively participates in the fights to put an end to Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and the creation of a fair peace between Israel and Palestine. The war in Gaza, the crimes of Hamas, and the deaths of dozens of thousands of Palestinian civilians render international solidarity the ultimate challenge. For Lynne, this active support is a result of her socialistic feminism, as well as for her devotion and dedication in the practices and theories of care. Her biggest contribution in the past decade. Care, the tangible care, administration, material, and emotional support to others. And this has been underestimated and devalued symbolically as well as materially. Historically, care has been marginalized as non-productive or as unpaid domestic women's work. Only recently, we added to that the precarious, badly paid, poorly paid work for the working immigrants. Sexism is combined with racism in order to devalue this vital work and these vital tasks. This discredited state welfare and the savage austerity policies have led to an increased need and have led to a huge deficit of care. So we have been before two big waves of solidarity and care in 2015 and 2016. Close to 1 million refugees reached Greece. So at the port of Piraeus, in the E2 terminal, where many thousands of refugees have sought refuge, citizens had makeshift preparations for a network of hospitality, solidarity, reception, acceptance, and all their basic needs like food, health, care, psychological support were covered by other citizens in solidarity who poured in and staffed health centers, pharmacies, etc. You see how things have changed with the pushbacks and pillows, the pillows shipwrecked, etc. We then had the pandemic, during which the people remember their social and biological vulnerability that had been buried under the immeasurable narcissism and consumerism of the previous period. We understood that in emergencies, it's not the individualism that will save us, but rather social solidarity and caring for others. What's not what the markets do not bring forward are biological and social survival through the public goods and services. So we understood the significance of very humble menial jobs, such as supermarket employees, cleaners, delivery personnel, etc. The responsibility for solidarity as the policy is politics. The care for others is politics. I participate in the protection of the weak because I fight for social justice. So it is a political and moral element to show care because this is an inherent component of ontology, of what means to be human. So we have many different imaginations, fantasies, with desires, dreams, which constitute a universe of unique meanings that is made up of each and every one of us. Every world is a point of openness, of ecstasy, of distancing, a point where we're out of ourselves, but also exposed to others, together with others, coexisting. Others come always first, and they ask us in their hour of needs to help them because their existence and our existence depends on other. I am because I am related to the existence of others, to other existences. We're talking about an otherness of existence. In this ontology, community means a community of empathy, relation, outreach, transmission. So these are the truths that are reminded to us by Lynne. The Care Manifesto that she has published together with the Care Collective, with the participation of our own fellow Andreas Hatzidakis. So this care manifesto proposes and suggests a broad definition of care that tries to respond to all economic and ecological challenges, ranging from gender equality, racial inequalities, minorities disparities, to environmental sustainability. All challenges nowadays render pressing the need to understand and practice care. Such theoretical and practical initiatives are the ones that we need, because currently we are at a point of extreme darkness as well as extreme clarity. Darkness because we don't know where the light will come from. Clarity because we know that we need to dare to be bold enough to start from scratch, to get rid of any dogmatism and to question all these principles that have led to today's catastrophe and disaster. We need to be able to build a new political thought, a new political imagination, a new meaning for humankind to give us a new vision for the future. The others as unique, unparalleled, finite existence. The world is our interdependence and coexistence. Ourselves as others, being ourselves through caring for others and the otherness. So this is what we are taught by Lynne, an optimist troublemaker, Lynne.
Nicos Poulantzas Institute.
Kostas, that was such an incredibly generous and rich account of my work. Could we really have done all those things? Also, you make me sound more optimistic than I feel right now, which will be clear from my talk. But it is wonderful to be reminded of all the many things that we did and how confident we were back in the 1970s. Actually, a week ago, I was speaking at a conference on the subversive 1970s that Michael Hart has just written a book called The Subversive 1970s, Hart of Hart and Negri, who sadly has just died. And he's as confident as ever, actually. He can always see things about to occur, but I didn't altogether share all that optimism. But you'll see from my talk tonight why I am rather troubled by many things, but the resources for hope, optimism of the will. Yeah.
More pessimistic than
Yes, well, I'll do my best not to eradicate all sources of optimism if I can. So you can see I began with this very well-known quote from Brecht. I thought I was going to be talking in the Goethe Institute, so that seemed appropriate. But let me just begin by thanking you for inviting me to for inviting me to give this annual Nicos Poulantzas lecture. Let me get my text up to make sure I don't leave anything out. Because it's always exciting to be back in Athens. I love Athens, and I like to come here, although perhaps I'll have to do it virtually in future. I don't like traveling. So it's an honor, a great honor to be here, and it was wonderful to get that introduction, Kostas. But although it's an honor, for me right now, it's also a challenge, and a far bigger challenge than I realized when I accepted the invitation. I certainly did not expect that we would be living in quite such dark times. And you mentioned the dark times, but I'm going to say more of them, because it's really only a few months old that, for me, darkness has just descended everywhere. And I actually find it hard to talk in a composed and controlled way about anything, even about care for ourselves, care for each other, care for the world, which of course I have written so much about and tried to engage in. I find it hard in times such as these to do anything but look out at the state of the world. So that's why I resorted to Brecht back in 1939, after being forced to flee his homeland when the Nazis came to power, when he says, as I say here, even to talk about trees seems almost a crime because it entails silence about so many misdeeds. Are we heading back to those times today? Well, that is the really big fear. Fascism on the horizon. So much silence, such iniquitous misdeeds. Western governments still refuse to act seriously to try and prevent Israel's ongoing apocalyptic violence in Gaza, following the unexpected total atrocity of Hamas on October the 7th, with the brutal massacre of 1,147 in southern Israel and 240 hostages taken away to Gaza. 3 of them recently shot yesterday by the Israeli army. Anyway, this happens, of course, with Israel led by the extreme right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu, and their immediate declaration of war on Gaza, which of course was bound to happen following what the atrocity which Hamas had performed, has resulted in the completely unprecedented bombardment ever since. And it really is unprecedented. People are actually saying it might be historically unprecedented ever, the level of violence that is happening in Gaza today. Despite a 7-day pause that you all know about. But the situation now, as you'll know, is that there is simply no safe space for civilians anywhere in Gaza. So far, well over 20,000 Palestinians have been killed, many buried alive, with hundreds of thousands injured, 2 million displaced and destitute, more than half of them children, the landscape flattened, buildings and social infrastructures alike. Forgotten how to read. Those left alive now are all homeless, shattered, starving or freezing to death. The lack of Western action to prevent the extremity of such violence is unparalleled in my lifetime. Meanwhile, state-backed settlers are destroying villages in the West Bank. So in the face of such unspeakable suffering, it is devastating to see one social media trend in Israel, and perhaps this happens during atrocities, I don't know, but to see them joyfully dressing up to mock Gazan deaths, agony and loss. One such Instagram platform is almost unbelievably to me said to have 6 million followers. You probably know what I'm talking about, women pretending to be Palestinians and pretending to carry dead babies and so on, and everybody laughing about it. Anyway, what this tells me is that the spread of such total inhumanity amongst the perpetrators of this spectacular violence, inciting only derision amongst so many Israeli citizens, tells me that I'd better put my glasses on. And it surely means that Israel itself also can only emerge as lasting losers in this war, despite and because of its near genocidal nature. As a Jewish woman from generations of active anti-Zionists, I haven't just been an anti-Zionist for 20 years. My family goes back to the late 19th century, and every member of my extended family has always been anti-Zionists, and quite actively so. And I've worked myself for over 2 decades for a just peace between Israel and Palestine, as Kostas said. The situation now, as you can imagine, transcends tragedy, creating inexpressible grief. I can only say that these are the darkest times I have ever known, and really, I could simply stand here and weep for the next hour. I find it quite hard, right at this moment, to do anything but despair. However, I have another slide. The only hope I find nowadays is marching on the streets calling for a ceasefire. Moments of hope, practices of care arise when solidarity is at its highest. As for instance, in London on November the 11th, Armistice Day. And what happened then was joining many hundreds of thousands, 800,000 probably, marched in London for an Israeli ceasefire and the return of hostages. Our numbers were so huge that heading for the start of the march, many of us simply got trapped underground at Marble Arch tube station, not a nice place to be. There were literally hundreds of us on the steps trying to get up into the park. So we were at a standstill all together in what might have been a terrifying situation, young and old, all strangers to each other, women in their headscarves, children with Palestinian flags, Jews with our badges of identity, all packed tightly together with so little room. But no frustration or anger or impatience arose as distances collapsed between us. Ethnic and religious differences all collapsed, and instead there was just this sense that nothing bad could happen. There couldn't be any violence. There was only solidarity and care between us. I was asked by The Guardian, actually, to write about something hopeful that has happened this year. So, of course, I've written about that. So it will appear in The Guardian with my only reason to hope this year. So instead of violence, which had been predicted, and predicted by our then appalling Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, because it was Armistice Day and we were apparently just going there to cause riot and violence. There was no violence, of course, from the 800,000 on that march. There was violence on the streets of London that day, but they came from Braverman's supporters, our opponents, who were there to try and prevent us marching. And they, of course, were violent. Meanwhile, have I got another slide? Oh, yes. Meanwhile, although violence in Gaza is by far the worst catastrophe right now, this is not the only darkness on the horizon. Across Europe and beyond, we are witnessing the most troubling rise of the far right. Most recently, it was the success of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom. What? Oh. Will I carry on? For Freedom in the Netherlands. Italy is headed up by the far-right government of Giorgia Meloni, who you can see represented there. Marine Le Pen's Populist National Party is said to be on track to win the French presidency. And we've seen the right come to power even in the once consistently social democratic Sweden, while the far-right Alternative for Germany, the AfD, is increasingly strong. Indeed, only the victory of the neoliberal Tusk in Poland slightly bucks this trend a little. Further afield, we have the shocking election last month of the maverick far-righter Xavier Milei in Argentina, a place recently the bastion of progressive feminists and left struggles after they finally jettisoned their military rulers exactly 40 years ago. We have Modi in India, Orban in Hungary, Trump on the horizon. I could go on, but you get the picture of a very gloomy political moment. And so to Greece. It is the 10th anniversary, exactly a decade, since the murder of the anti-fascist rapper Pavlos Fyssas, I might mispronounce that, by the self-described fascist group Golden Dawn. We know that after spectacular protests, Golden Dawn was banned and its leaders jailed. Although, sadly, I hear that the ideals and followers of Golden Dawn have far from disappeared, while the far right is reorganizing itself. Indeed, far-right activists and neo-Nazi organizations in Greece called for a pan-European memorial in Athens to commemorate the 10 years since 2 young Golden Dawn members were killed, with 21 members of the Italian neo-fascist group Casa Pound later arrested on arrival in Athens to support them. Indeed, in this latest Greek government, I read, the far right received a total of 14.2% of the vote in your recent elections and are now estimated to comprise 16% of the current Greek parliament, said to be working well with the centre-right governing group New Democracy. Indeed, I read this now constitutes the most far-right parliament since the fall of the military dictatorship in 1974. Meanwhile, the Greek monitoring network for studying and countering the far left report that the main factors feeding far-right views are still being mainstreamed in the press and other political parties, promoting extreme nationalism and violence towards refugees and migrants as a false answer to economic woes. We know the result, promoting not just a lack of care for asylum seekers, but at times lethal violence towards refugees and migrants. But of course, Greece is far from alone in this. It is all the more chilling that this should be happening on the 90th anniversary of Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933, 90 years. So, what has become of the left? Once the place of hope, standing for a more redistributive, caring and just world. In most parts of the world, with brief exceptions, it has been shrinking in the face of the neoliberal juggernaut rolling over us all. And this finally brings me to my scheduled topic tonight, the need for a radical politics of care. Something for which the Women's Liberation Movement, that's an early poster from the Women's Liberation Movement, my own political formation and home, paved the way back in the 1970s. It all began by stressing the importance of domestic life and the devaluation and marginalization of women with their work seen as quintessentially unproductive, as Kostos mentioned. Women's work, the work of care, thought a mere labour of love. And just before swerving away from Greece, I want to share with you that as soon as the Greek military dictatorship was brought to an end in 1974, my friend Sheila Rowbottom travelled to Athens to speak at what proved to be the very first public meeting of the Athenian women's movement, urged on by the passion of the Greek socialist feminist you probably know, Eleni Varikas, who would soon emerge as a leading feminist scholar. As many of you will probably all know, a key goal of women's liberation movement that emerged at the close of the 1960s, really in 1969 was when pamphlets and everything were really taking off. The function of everything that was happening then was precisely to introduce new ways of seeing into the left. Most of us were not in any way separatist feminists. We were a part of the left, and we wanted to change the left. We wanted to envisage the total transformation of the society, but not just in terms of wages, not just in terms of state power, though we wanted change there, but in how we live and how we care for each other. However, in the end, despite our critics, it was not feminism, but underlying economic shifts, that juggernaut of neoliberalism in contemporary capitalism, that would result in a full-blown crisis of care, which we're all living with today. I can see I'm getting my slides up slightly too early, so bear with them. Bear with me till I get to them. There are so many reasons for this crisis of care, which some of you may have already seen sketched out in our Care Manifesto from 2020, written by our London Care Collective. There we are there. Soon extremely popular and being translated into many languages, including into, oops, this is what I meant to change here, including, as I hope many of you will know, and some of you will have read, into a Greek Care Manifesto. And that version appeared with an introduction from Andreas, but also with a foreword and great help and encouragement from Athena Athanasiou, who is there in the audience. So I want to thank you for being part of that Greek translation and all the encouragement we've all received from you. So, first up, what we're saying in the manifesto is what I've been suggesting. Underlying our ongoing care crisis is the entrenchment of neoliberal policies and outlook from the very close of the 1970s, as the right came to power in the UK with Margaret Thatcher, then in the US with Ronald Reagan, and soon influencing the global politics in the EU and elsewhere. Many people actually say it all began in Chile with Pinochet, but wherever it exactly began, and people were, neoliberal theorists actually go back to the 20s and 30s, but they got pushed aside by a wave of social democracy until they emerge again after economic crises and the rise of the right in the mid to late 1970s. Anyway, what is neoliberalism about, and why does it totally undermine care? It does because it stands for putting markets to the fore across the board, producing an economic order that enabled both the evisceration and outsourcing of welfare states and benefits of welfare states, becoming normalized. And the idea as well, that the neoliberal rationality that we should all judge our own selves according to our market worth. So some of us have written more about that, like Catherine Rottenberg in her book on the rise of neoliberal feminism, or Wendy Brown, who's spoken here, who has much to say about the neoliberal takeover even of consciousness. So, what can we even begin to say, trying to turn around the devastating neglect and greed we've seen in the wake of this prioritizing of markets and maximization of profits for the tiny few, of course, and impoverishment for the many, when only the very opposite agenda, an agenda of radical care, can begin to shift us out of the resulting wreckage. What have I got next? Another point Kostas made. Well, first up, as we argued in the Care Manifesto, we have to enrich our impoverished language of care as many feminists have been doing for quite some time, especially from the 1980s, such as Joan Tronto and others, who've been arguing for 4 decades. We must expand and enrich our understanding of care as well as to fight for its possibility. Care is not only the hands-on care of directly looking after the physical and emotional needs of others, crucial as this obviously is, but it's also about recognizing our human interdependence and our shared vulnerability throughout our lives. It's as well also understanding our ever greater global interdependence, which means caring across borders, caring for refugees, who are often refugees because of what the global West has been involved in other parts of the world, seeing the causes of people needing to seek shelter elsewhere. And also, surely, if the COVID pandemic has taught us anything, it has underlined this global interdependence. So care then involves whatever enables us all to live and to flourish along with the world we inhabit. I've said that care work has been undervalued because it's seen largely as women's work, which traditionally went unpaid, barely seen as workers at all, marginalised as unproductive. Yet feminists always stress that care is the cornerstone of social reproduction, that is, of all that enables people to survive and reproduce themselves, and therefore is actually both essential to and completely embedded within the economy. But this is hardly noticed in outlooks that can see no further than markets and profits. So, caring is gendered. I've got all my slides slightly muddled up. Yet, in today's world, with both women and men working long hours in paid jobs, we have a huge care deficit in richer countries. And it's met by a whole global care chain of predominantly poor immigrant and non-white women who perform much of our caring work. Thus, again, as Kostos quoted, racism combines with traditional sexism and global inequality to further devalue caring in our time. Also, care work is undervalued and often repudiated because of widespread contempt and devaluation of so-called dependency. That's also at the heart of neoliberal ideology, contempt for the notion of dependency. Symbolic manhood has always presented itself as the very antithesis of dependency. Now, this absurd gender cliche, men as autonomous, women as dependent, has oddly only been strengthened by the last 4 decades of neoliberal exaltation of individual resilience, autonomy, and productivity, all deepening the disavowal of actually shared human fragility and dependence. So ideal citizens today, male and female alike, must be tough and entrepreneurial, imagining themselves with the delusion that they are entirely self-sufficient, though encouraged to embrace self-care to keep ourselves sleek and employable and pretty and attractive. Such pathologizing of dependency accompanied a constant shaming heaped upon welfare claimants, declared scroungers, despite 12 times more tax evasion than welfare fraud. Actually, it's probably a lot more than 12 times, given all that happened during COVID with some of the super rich managing to defraud governments at an absolutely extraordinary rate. And yet they're not called scroungers. Hopefully a few of them will go to jail, but most of them will get away with it. Also, attending to the needs of others to get back on track, to care metrics, not market metrics, often means confronting vulnerability. So however rewarding hands-on caring can be, knowing that we want to care for the person we're caring for. It can also be daunting as well as exhausting, confronting us with our own and others' mortal embodied selves. And that's also why it's been traditionally relegated to women or servants, people deemed inferior precisely because they are doing this vital, visceral, tactile work of maintenance. Avoiding caring can therefore enable others to disavow thoughts of their own inescapable fragility and inevitable mortality. Not having to care about others has been a sign of wealth and power. As the late anthropologist David Graeber noted in Caring Too Much, that's the curse of the working classes. Though he would also argue that the ability to care, both caring for and being cared for, and being able to care, wanting to care, is actually a basic human condition. It's actually essential to all of our humanity. So it's precisely because of these complexities and challenges of care, because of the mixed emotions caring may involve, that we need to fight for all the necessary social infrastructures and resources to enable and assist us in the work of caring. All the resources that the Israeli army has just smashed in Gaza, hospitals, schools, universities, etc. Anyway, to get back, we need all the infrastructure and resources to assist us in being able to care, from our queer and alternative kinship networks to rebuilding and revaluing our caring professions and rebuilding our communities, as well as caring for the environment. Far from public spending creating pathologies of dependencies, as the political right loves to tell us, the reverse is true. Only with adequate and secure resources can everyone develop and maintain whatever capabilities they have, and we all have the capabilities, to ensure some sense of autonomy and to escape being rendered helpless and passive. Disability rights activists, as we'll see, have always known this, arguing for a notion of independence or autonomy and control over their lives, despite the recognition of their dependence on distinct forms of care. Thus, we need to jettison any linking of dependency with pathology. Dependency and autonomy are not binaries, pointing in opposite directions. So when I looked on the web, I saw dozens of images like that. You know, make your choice, dependent or autonomous, which do you want to be? We need to jettison any linking of dependency with pathology. Dependency and autonomy are not binaries, pointing in opposite directions, but two sides of the very same coin. It is those with most resources who are actually most dependent on all the people they employ to look after them. All the people looking after them is actually a sign of their wealth and so on. The many who service them when they hardly need servicing, while those most in need of care will frequently be those who receive least help. So, developing all these thoughts in my very latest book here, which I don't think is available in Athens, so I don't know how you're going to get hold of it, but somehow beg, steal or borrow it, if you can. Developing all these thoughts in my latest book, Lean on Me, I step back to measure all that has changed in my own lifetime, both for better and, more recently, so much for worse. My particular story is obviously UK-based, but I think it has resonances elsewhere. In much of the Western world, the amazing emergence of women's liberation, which thrived in the 1970s, created a movement eagerly seeking transformative change on all fronts. That's where all my optimism came from, beginning with the ties drawn between home and the workplace, the reproductive and productive systems. Thus, my book opens reflecting on motherhood, which provides most people's blueprint for caring. In one key struggle, women's liberation was busy fighting to overturn the isolation and marginalization of women's post-war experiences of motherhood, something we all knew from our own mothers' troubled lives. It's often said that women's liberationists hated children and didn't want babies. To the contrary, many of us, like me, were mothers, and that's what took us into women's liberation and the struggle for feminism. What's more, there were initially, this is the 1970s, still for a while, an expanding social democratic time, there were many victories, a time of great movement politics as well, especially in securing reproductive rights, confronting doctors' arrogance or the feelings of helplessness so many women had described in maternity wards, shoved around as though they were just nothing, even denied access to their babies when they were born. That happened to me, actually. Didn't see my baby for a week. Anyway, as well as in fighting for and winning more funding for nurseries and other community resources. Now, this occurred alongside success in increasing women's financial independence, while demanding, and interestingly, often demanding successfully, men's greater involvement in domestic work. So that was my life. That was the source of this optimism back in the 1970s. What is now so shocking is how quickly such victories can be snatched away, with even reproductive rights curtailed in the USA. It's almost unbelievable, doesn't it? It was like the struggle, reproductive rights as well, the right to have children, the right not to have children. And now, in so many states in America, that is being removed. In fact, it was arising in Argentina, where it had been totally banned, and they said, oh, well, you'll have to learn from us now in the States to work out how to fight for reproductive rights. So I don't know how they're going to get on under their new leader. They'll be back in deep struggle again. While in Britain's post-Thatcher years and the later arrival of austerity regimes from the 1990s, welfare and community resources have just kept on shrinking. It's hard to ignore the distress of mothers today, routinely pressed for time, money and resources. In Britain and the USA, which I read most about, hardly any mothers feel that they are doing an adequate job of parenting. Even affluent stay-at-home mums, studied by Shani Orgard in Britain, mention constant anxieties raising children in our ultra-competitive world, while displaying that sense of isolation and exclusion that mothers in the 1950s once expressed. So, there have been so many books about this, but ones you might have heard of, scholars such as Jacqueline Rose and Eliana Glazer in Britain have recently distilled the chilling effects of this heartlessness towards mothers. No time, no resources, trying to raise children that are going to be able to survive in this harsh, competitive world. This is a situation. Half of all British mothers, and actually I've read similar statistics from the States, suffer mental health problems before and after giving birth. 50% of new mothers report chronic loneliness. We thought we'd remove that. And suicide is the leading cause of death for mothers during their baby's first year. So much for women's liberation, which really did change things, and look where we are now. Similar patterns emerge elsewhere in education, my workplace for 50 years, in the UK, in the US, In Australia and elsewhere, I wonder what's happening here, we've seen rising inequalities within schools, along with extraordinary attacks on the very notion of education for its own sake. Universities are increasingly forced to conform to market dogma, whereas once they were able to offer some alternative ethic, even an antidote to the commercial world, by insisting upon the value of pursuing knowledge entirely for its own sake, and in the process producing a more knowledgeable people and more democratic societies. So the assault on humanities is an assault on democracy, but it's all done as yet another attempt to marketize education and deny people the tools to understand the world better, or assist us in exploring better ways to create a fairer and more caring world. As I've already... No, I'm not ready for that one yet. I have my disability slides disappeared. As I've already mentioned in Lean on Me, I also prioritise the significance of disability struggles in opening out the complexities of vulnerability, and showing why autonomy and dependence, as I said, are two sides of the same coin. And here again, disability activists at first won many struggles promoting what they called a social model of disability. They rejected the notion of themselves as intrinsically vulnerable, saying that this had routinely served as a pretext for their exclusion from public life. Disability activists, many in the most moving language and vivid performances, I don't know if you've seen any, but they're very impressive, expressed their sense of extreme social exclusion, as well as the suspiciousness and dismissive attitudes greeting them much of the time. And there are studies also of literature and so on, showing that even disabled children are presented in negative ways. They're not really ill, they're not really frail, you know. They could get up from their wheelchairs and walk if they wanted to. I think that's one of the story of Heidi and her friend in a wheelchair. While saying they also wanted to celebrate what they could be and sometimes are. So you get lots of disabled dance groups and singing groups and so on and so forth. So at first, as with women's liberation in the 1970s and early 1980s, activists again won battles for greater access to social infrastructures, which others could rely upon. You know, more ramps, more ways of assisting them to take part in public life, leading to increased social inclusion and self-reliance. The only problem, though, is this language of self-reliance could and later would be distorted to tune in with that damaging contempt for dependency, which I've already said a bit about. Always shadowing attempts to cut back on welfare provision and push everyone into the market in what other little way they can to make profits for the few super rich people, which is at the heart of neoliberal thinking. So some like me, carefully pondering issues of vulnerability, prefer to stress interdependence rather than any emphasis on independence, which aligns itself a little too readily with that denigration of dependency and accords with mainstream thinking in failing to stress the importance of relationships. Far worse, under new austerity regimes, such as we've seen in the UK since 2010 and elsewhere, there were soon constant assaults on those in need of disability benefits, with endless demands that the disabled had to prove themselves unfit to work. So there were constant capability tests, work assessment capability it was called, which many failed, however disabled they were, whatever their physical or emotional impairment. And in the UK, repeatedly testing individuals' fitness for work produced the continual denial of those in need, urgent need of support, leading to untold misery, frequent suicide for many disabled people wrongly assessed, with, of course, much class and race bias in the assessments. And I could say a lot more about that. Actually, of course, I could say a lot more about everything. But very similar stories arise when we look at ageing, given the millions of older people whose needs are not being met today and were lethally neglected, as you probably know, in the early COVID years in Britain. Tens of thousands died without their deaths even being mentioned, as old people were sent from the hospitals back into care homes without assessing whether or not they had COVID symptoms. But overall, fears of aging haunt us all, even all of us here perhaps. Not just of mortality, but fear of frailty and dependence. So it's this that generates such alarm, even defensive paranoia, resulting in the neglect and avoidance of old people unless they are fit and robust, as I like to pretend to be. I'm not at all. So much stigma faces old people, above all old crones, women, that it can undermine our sense of who we are or our place in the world. Many older people routinely confront loneliness and neglect in old age, devoid of responsive care and empathy. Indeed, Age UK, representing old people in Britain, reports that 500,000 older people rarely see anyone, perhaps once a week, while poverty, race and ethnicity, of course, play the usual big role in producing deprivation in the elderly. So for a while I've been trying to use my own experiences as an old woman to battle ageism. Yet at present, the overall care for the elderly remains abysmal. Today it ties in with the privatisation of the public sector, which in the UK has meant the financialisation of care homes and outsourcing of public care provision, creating huge profits for the global few, while leaving many simply unable to pay for the essential care they need. Meanwhile, those underpaid carers suffer from lack of time or resources to care adequately. So here again we see care ethics being completely at odds with market ethics. Indeed, one British Tory MP looking at our care system actually admitted that it incentivizes poor care, low wages and neglect, with little regard for the people it is supposed to be looking after. Though he didn't go on to say, let's bring back in-house all these, let's stop privatising our welfare. He didn't say that, but he did notice there was something very wrong with what is happening now. Anyway, it's hard to focus on any one area of neglect when wherever we look, we can see others also being neglected and their needs ignored. In my book, I also address the harms of our prison system, which is all about inequality and the missing place of care in our societies, as stressed by the anti-prison movement, which has always been quite large in the States, but is growing a little in Britain. I have no idea about here. Given the role of entrenched racism, the anti-prison movement sprung up first and foremost in the USA, with voices you'll know of and who've spoken here, like that of Angela Davis, most familiar, and ever since, black people being in the forefront of connecting our appalling prison system and its ties to lack of care overall. The cruelties of our time are also writ large in the neglect and abuse of asylum seekers, with Greece a staging post for our shared failure, Europe's shared failure to tackle this problem. Official hostility towards asylum seekers is evident globally, but the bodies of refugees now carpet the Mediterranean, turning it into the world's largest burial ground, following the reluctance of British and European states to rescue migrant boats in trouble. The British government's current shameful attempts to deport refugees to Rwanda, and many other things they're doing, has rightly been described as treating refugees like human waste, and a complete refusal to understand what drives people to seek shelter elsewhere, as well as what our involvement in their having to migrate might be. Yet, despite all the complicity with racism guiding government policies and also helping to inaugurate the right into power, there is also much care and solidarity evident from some battling to assist asylum seekers. In her collection, The New Internationalists from 2020, my friend Sue Clayton, for instance, collects reflections from 60 of those activist volunteers, from the many thousands that she knows, explaining their work, encountering the inhumanity towards asylum seekers. Clayton herself worked to assist many children she found stranded in Calais, many of them entitled to come to Britain, but Britain refused to assess them, to allow them to come. And she managed to get some of them in, to rescue some of them from the Calais jungle. I've been through the most appalling times, of course, which she documents in her impressive film, Calais Children, Children of Calais, a case to answer, Calais Children. Other volunteers provide emergency aid for refugees, conduct sea rescues, as well as searches, or help organise protests and advocacy in support of migrants. These activists also register the catastrophic failure of international NGOs, many international NGOs, unable to do more than stand by as refugees are herded into oppressive holding camps, which you'll know all about here, waiting interminably for asylum applications to be processed. My own birthplace, Australia, was ahead of the game with its disgraceful asylum strategy. Many people are now copying it, like Britain, imprisoning refugees offshore, for a while in the notorious Manus Island detention centre in Papua New Guinea. One inmate for many years was the Kurdish journalist Behrouz Boochani, fleeing persecution in Iran. After eventually gaining asylum in New Zealand, having extraordinarily, while in prison, managed to publish a book describing his ordeal, No Friend But the Mountain, which he published which he wrote on tiny phones, which kept being confiscated, but he kept on writing. He ended up winning some big prize. I can't remember if it was the book or what it was. So Boochani, now in New Zealand, dedicates his life to helping empower marginalised people everywhere, aiming to rehumanize the dehumanized, he says. Working with Australian Aboriginal people, for instance, Boochani emphasises that the ties between refugees and Indigenous people are significant, noting that we humans have no sanctuary except in mutual warmth and support. And this brings me finally to our government's refusal to fight climate change, where indeed it's crucial to register the resistance from Indigenous voices, as well as the amazing toll they've faced, systematically murdered with impunity, almost daily. In the UK, we are now living with polluted rivers, which nothing is being done about, while aware of climate disasters around the globe. Yet as climate activists such as George Monbiot in Britain have been illustrating for decades, our governments primarily respond to their largest economic backers. And of course, their largest economic backers are fossil fuel producers. So that's why they play such a big role in, still, at this moment, our Tory government has sanctioned more fossil fuel production. And of course, recently we had the maddening idiocy of the latest UN's COP28 supposedly to deal with climate change, sponsored by in Dubai and headed up by one of the leading fossil fuel producers in the world, the startlingly notorious Sultan Al Jaber. I know a lot of people know a lot about this person and how he treats women and how he treats his servants and so on. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls our government's lack of concern about fossil fuels a war on nature, senseless and suicidal. So, how to end? Because, of course, I could continue forever. I've hardly scratched the surface, but I guess I need to hand things over to you and to our shared evening. How to end? Well, only by re-emphasizing, like so many today, most prominently, for instance, Judith Butler and many others in this audience, but Butler in all her recent writing, that we must begin with the recognition of human interdependence on each other and the planet we inhabit, as well as our shared vulnerability throughout our lives. This entails derailing our current capitalist regime, beginning with rebuilding all our weakened social infrastructures across the board and detaching them from finance capital. It means rebuilding our local communities, knowing that adequate care for all is the only basis for a truly democratic society. We do need to celebrate our mutual aid practices, which particularly in the years of COVID expanded, and many remain today, of people trying to help each other and help those most in need, while arguing that we're all collectively responsible for providing for and supporting each other, for helping to maintain our communities, while preserving public spaces generally, increasingly closed down in neoliberal times, and working for a green, sustainable economy. Now that becomes possible only with many things being fought for, including, for instance, shorter working hours and a basic income for all, which some unions are currently highlighting, in particular those shorter working hours, which is very important if we're going to change how we live. So let me conclude by suggesting that some sense of public engagement is necessary both for sustaining our confidence individually as well as for preserving any sense of our shared humanity. Such a shared humanity also requires a cosmopolitan outlook. So let's fight for mutual care, not just self-care, helping us to combat isolation. And after all, isolation and loneliness is said to affect 1 in 4 people globally. And sometimes, as we come together, we may experience more joy, collective joy. I also wrote a book about that, actually, on collective joy. Because in the end, all we have is each other. However, helping each other is not just an interpersonal affair, although it is that. It will also require the harnessing of resources that only local authorities, national governments, regional and global networks can ensure to try and facilitate our ability to understand, relate to and support one another. Those humanities are rather important. So let me say, to conclude, that's why Poulantzas knew that we must always be in and against the state, knowing we need it, and also how much we must work to change it. Contradiction is the name of the left in government, as my chair, Kostas, has reiterated several times, perhaps finding a few more contradictions than he expected when in government. Finally, the fact that our governments are tolerating, to return to where I began, are tolerating the ongoing near genocide in Gaza tells me that unless we dramatically shift course, we really are all doomed. To prevent that, it is incumbent upon us all to work in whatever ways we find possible, promoting a politics of hope and a politics of solidarity. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm so glad to see you in my audience. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Lynn. You have a wonderful way of weaving together many strands in many arguments. You know, feminism, socialism, internationalism, the Palestine tragedy, the struggle against disability, discrimination, ageism, and so on. Bring them together and make them sound like a seamless web, like a tapestry in which each one of them finds its place. And at the end of my short introduction, I was thinking, and I was arguing that perhaps the left needs a new theory, a new strategy, perhaps a new vision. And it dawned upon me as I was listening to you that perhaps care, that wide definition of care that you presented to us today, and in your care manifesto with Andreas and others, is perhaps a concept and a value that has not been sufficiently worked or adopted or understood by the left. I mean, we hear ideas today, resilience, security. These are the big new themes of the left. And it seems to me, whether one wants to go along with that, that this idea of care based on this absolutely essential ontological factor that we depend on each other, that being a self means being always with the other in ourselves and we in the other. So that kind of ontology for which care is by definition automatically the key value seems to me to be something that the left has to think a little more. We have not done that. Not only for the obvious reasons that care was always devalued, given to women with no importance or to migrants and so on, but because care, by founding itself, by being founded on this sense of otherness, of alterity, of being always with the other, introduces into politics a strong moral element, which is not always there. And indeed, quite often it is being dismissed. But anyway, I think, you gave us food for thought. Certainly, I think we can take it further in terms of how care can become a left and socialist concept in a much more obvious way. But let me first open it to the floor. Now, you may want to ask questions or to make short comments either in English or in Greek. Whoever would prefer to speak in Greek, you are very welcome. And there will be a microphone going around for people who want to make a short comment or ask a question. So, over to the audience. Please take it over and ask Lynne. She covered so many areas, so I'm sure so that you can find sufficient ground, to have a question or a comment. Athena, over there, our wonderful friend Athena Athanasiou.
Thank you, Lynne. Thank you so much for this wonderfully invigorating talk, which I took as a call for a feminist left response to increasing precarity and structural inequalities in the context and in an age of a neoliberal evisceration of welfare systems and services. A question that might arise here is this. Given that care as a concept is carrying a heavy burden of all kinds of dominant genealogies, including, as you put it, possessive individualism and patriarchal stereotypes about, paternalistic victimization, protection, and all that, heteronormativity. How to reaffirm, how to reaffirm care as a political concept while maintaining this critique, this very important critique of all these care abuses. And I think that you traced wonderfully this trajectory from women's liberation movement to all the way to contemporary intersectional feminist queer theory. And I think they have been all very much aware of these perils around different abuses of care. One way to respond to this conundrum is, I think, and I would like to invite your thoughts about that, is to turn towards care activism, histories of care activism, including, for example, this wonderful moment of ACT UP, the way in which the AIDS, HIV movement mobilized care as a political concept of not only of a careful response, but also a transformative response of different and overlapping, intersecting power relations.
Thank you for that question. And I want to stress again how grateful we are to you for all the work you did for the Greek version of the manifesto. But I wanted to return to our own personal history, which Andreas says I'm always reminding him of. That is that I started writing a book, Lean on Me, about care, just before we came together to form the CARE reading group. And when we came together to form the CARE reading group, a number of people were not at all sure about using the word care. Quite a lot. Not me. They said, shouldn't we say solidarity? Care just felt too wishy-washy. It wasn't struggle, solidarity. And so that's the left, struggle, and some of the women too were saying, care, we're not sure about care. So we had to fight, and I can't quite remember how we won that battle. Perhaps it was reading people like Joan Tronto and others, that care is essential to democracy. Unless you have a proper caring society and everybody engaged in the world because, they have the resources to look after themselves and each other, you don't have any democratic society. And so I think to me, it's crucial that care does become a part of the left language in which it isn't. I mean, even our most radical people, like my wonderful MP, Jeremy Corbyn, who's always being attacked, they still, you have to push them to think about care. And I did think once, as you say, you rethink about care and care activism. And there's always been care activism, not just in ACT UP, but for instance, around motherhood, fighting to have the resources to care. And recent people writing about motherhood have pointed out that so many mothers are relying on paid carers today, and we have to have an alliance between mothers and those care workers, to include better conditions for all of them, both shorter working time for mothers, but also better wages and conditions for those doing the care work. That it is actually all about activism, and particularly once you move on saying we're not just talking about hands-on care, but for heaven's sake, most of the strikes in London, in Britain, have been from care workers, actually. Those doing cleaning jobs and underpaid care workers in in the old age homes and so on, because they're so badly paid that they know they can't actually do proper caring work. So there's huge activism associated with care work, which maybe I haven't stressed enough. So that's very interesting. I think I'd better bring that into any future lectures I give. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And Athena, any further comments, questions? Over here, Maria Karamasin. Still here. Just wait for a minute.
I would like to mention some trends that we see all around. Okay, you have described the Anglo-Saxon model and austerity and all this attack to the welfare state that has cut back several services. We can find another movement at the EU level, which is quite the contrary, that we should improve social infrastructure and care. We should also include long-term care in our in the improvement of welfare state. So there is also at the EU level understanding and recognition of the needs of the care deficit in the aging societies. So there are other movements as well in these trends, and many times I think that people coming from the United States or the United Kingdom, Australia, etc., take this gloomy picture that nothing is happening and we are to be deprived of any kind of help, etc. At the same time, I may say that in our societies, wherever we live in, even in European societies, we are thinking of care as a burden, as something. I mean, in person. I don't mean about movements and solidarity and all these things, but caring for our own people. We are thinking that it is some burden that we should either commodify, put to the market, or get it to the state. So we are less and less eager to take over this need for care of our own people. So this is, in my sense, in my feeling, a kind of being overwhelmed by the dominant ideology that dependence, what you said, that dependence and interdependence is something that is outside of the values, of the current values. We should be self-reliant, we should live our lives, we should amuse ourselves, and care for the others is something that we should either outsource to other people or to the welfare state, etc., etc. So this is also, we also need to recognize the need for caring for other people in our lives.
Do you want to take a few, or do you want me to? I don't mind.
Are there a few more? Let's see. Let's gauge the audience.
Well, I shall.
Yes, the gentleman over there. Perhaps, why don't you answer to Maria, and then we'll take the gentleman over there on the left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, I mean, the whole point of Lean on Me is to try and not just not just to revalue caring, but to stress the importance of caring for, not just being cared for, but caring for. That is what actually makes us human. When we die, a lot of people, or even in old age, a lot of the sorrow that people have is not just being isolated and feeling uncared for, but not being able to care, not having people around them or the help and resources that would enable them to care. So people like me, already old, does have some of the friendships and resources that can help me to be involved still in the world, in trying to care for others, but most people don't. And I think it is an essential human need. And that's why so many people are lonely, isn't it? I mean, because there's just not people around them that they feel need them, because they can be caring towards them. So I think that is really important. But when I started my book, Lean on Me, my subtitle, which I tried to insist upon, was Disavowals of Dependency. But Verso was having nothing of that. That is much too negative, disavowals of dependency. So we had to get something more active than that. Although I think maybe I do call, at least the subheading is Disavowals of Dependency. But I do think it is crucial to see we are all dependent, we are all fragile, and this. See, even talk of resilience, I'm suspicious of the word resilience, even, yeah, because we need both to be cared for and care. This interdependence, that is the building block of being human. So everything you say, I do agree with. I just wanted to, something I meant to say in replying to Joanna was another group of caring activists is a lot of Caribbean workers in the States who do so much of the caring work, particularly from one island, which is escaping me which one it is now. And they've all begun writing about the work they do, but also how much they appreciate the work despite being underpaid for it, and how in their own communities they feel good about being carers. So they connect up in that way.
Thank you. The gentleman over there. Right in front of you.
Thank you very much. I will try to speak with my poor English.
Thank you.
But if I find difficulties, I will continue in Greek. Today, I think the speech was about a word which is, secondo me, synonymous from the Greek and the French word fraternité. Maybe we can say that this care is a progressive term, the fraternité. So I would like to explain us these differences between words like care and cure. Maybe between new liberalism and classical liberalism.
That's a different trajectory.
And some difference, but very quality difference between the term. I didn't find in your speech some report about the LGBT community. So it's very every day now in all the world, the difference between intersex and transgender. Η συντρόφισσα Αθανασίου ανέφερε τον όρο διεφυλικό.
The term transgender was used by a comrade. I don't know how she said it. In between intersex and transgender, we need to discriminate. There is a difference between these two. Thank you.
Oh, can I ignore that bit then? Good. I'll just quickly say something because I hope it will lead other people to say things. Another little argument we had at the beginning of our care reading group was Andreas saying there's no Greek word for care. So perhaps he might like to expand on what he meant, because we know it might relate to certainly fraternity isn't quite enough apart from it being so gendered, but fraternity, that is sort of closer to solidarity, isn't it? And solidarity is important, but there is more to care than solidarity. There is hands-on care as well as, care for the world and caring about all the crises. And that fraternity in no way covers that. In terms of the question you asked about neoliberalism, I'm glad I don't have to do intersex and transgender. Although you're right that I could have said a lot more about LGBT issues, a lot more. I mentioned queer networks, but in the manifesto, perhaps less in Lean on Me, interestingly, we have a lot to say about what we call promiscuous care. That is the importance of not seeing care as confined to the nuclear family, which again is taken away from. Care is something that women do, that, getting it right outside of that heterosexual context. But in terms of your question about classic neoliberalism and neoliberalism today, I think one difference would be that classic neoliberalism, which actually wasn't particularly popular then, relied on there being a sexual division of labour. And women would be doing all the caring work in the home, and then men could be out there doing what was most important, which was ensuring maximum profit. So that's classic neoliberalism. With the neoliberalism we have today, everyone is in the workforce. I mean, that's why we have such a crisis of care. Women are out there in the workforce with men, working ever longer hours, when of course we could be working far fewer in most jobs, or not doing the jobs at all because they're not providing anything useful for anybody. We all know it was said by who's the great social democrat that Keynes, yeah. That really people only needed to work 15 hours a week, and we probably could have a 15-hour week, but at the moment we're fighting, I think, for something a bit more but less than the 40-hour week, perhaps a 30-hour week or a 4-day week and so on. Because neoliberalism is like everyone, we value ourselves according to our market value. So, and that is different from Milton Friedman and so on, because I think he just relied on there being this other group of people, women who were outside of the market and could look after the world and each other. So that's what I'd say to that.
Okay, any further ideas?
Thank you so much for your talk. So I was wondering if care is a new way to talk about social reproduction theory without mentioning social reproduction theory, because I keep reading papers about care, and of course I think that it has brought a new perspective and it has been very productive, a new feminist and black perspective, but still I think that it's still social reproduction theory. So what do you have to say about this debate, and what are your thoughts about it? Thank you.
It's so interesting because all the questions do relate to debates we had in the Care Collective. I'm waiting for Andreas to say something about that. But so another thing that came up, particularly with friends, Marxist friends, who'd say, but why don't you talk about social reproduction? Why talk about care? And we just thought care was a far more immediate term for people to grasp. I mean, social reproduction, it's still very much tied to production, isn't it? There's that Marxist, it's hard to get away from you're socially reproducing the workforce and the care is for production. So I would rather get away from production. I think all care is productive work, but social reproduction was simply too tied in for some of us, and we won. So that we just didn't want that traditional Marxist terminology. We thought, care much more is the ethics of care, the feminist term, but we wanted to go beyond the ethics of care because we had criticisms of some of the ethics of care, less so Tronto, but some of the others who were very much relating it to women's maternal experience, and we learned how to care via motherhood. We weren't too keen on that because we think, not all mothers are caring, and the caring mothers do doesn't necessarily, expand into caring outside the family and caring for the world. So we tended to be a little critical of that. And now I've lost the thread of what on earth I was talking about. Care, yeah. So we wanted to expand the notion of care. So that was the importance of people like Joan Tronto. And there's many others. We keep mentioning her, and that's partly because my memory for names disappears, actually. But many others who have been, saying, care isn't just the work that mothers do. Certainly not that. It's a lot richer concept than that. So enriching that concept, a new language of care, was crucial to what I'm writing about in the book and what the manifesto was trying to do.
Το μικρόφωνο εδώ μπροστά αριστερά στον κύριο Χατζηδάκη.
Anyone else?
Well, to the last response, Lynne, I think another key difference, and we discussed this extensively, is social reproduction doesn't capture the more affective qualities of care, right? And, it's not just us, it's others, like people like Emma Dowling keep insisting on that. So the affective qualities of care are not quite captured with the notion of social reproduction, right? And indeed, I guess, and then before we talked about solidarity, we talked about the difficulties in translating care in Greek, and because care in English is a very capacious term, right? More flexible than in Greek. We have discussed this extensively with Athena as well. But I think there are two different struggles being reflected here. We had to push back a lot in relation to solidarity, in relation to our extended understanding, and these were conversations with comrades, if you like, right? We had, for example, the Women's Budget Group pushing back on the extended notion because in a fair enough way, they were asking what's the usefulness of such an expanded notion of care, and indeed an expanded understanding of shared vulnerability as well, when it comes to public policy. When it comes to responding to the real material conditions of those people that are, going through unspeakable miseries due to their disabling conditions, if you like, right? So we had a bit of many productive conversations in that sense amongst politically affiliated groups, but we also had, of course, again going back to Athena, this very fine task of distinguishing radical care from all the different appropriations at all different scales of, politics. From, in Greece now at the moment, we have a lot of care washing, right? We have OK Markets talking about OK Markets caring and whatever, right? Banks caring, and everyone is caring these days. And, this goes back to the notion of carerizing, that we have also talked about, and how care is used instrumentally at all scales of different life, to go back to family, from very oppressive mothers, that do many things in the name of care, to communities that, outcast specific individuals in the name of in-group care, to markets, etc., right? And, how can we, push back and claim a more radical understanding of care that is beyond difference and beyond distance, right? And just a very final point, very big conversations, but one thing that struck me in your presentation, and I didn't think about it before actually, you started with care's nemesis, violence, right? And you finished with loneliness, right? And I couldn't help but think of Hannah Arendt and her notion of organized loneliness as a key explanation for the rise of fascism, right? And totalitarianism. And, of course, the distinction between the two is also very relevant these days, right? What's the difference between totalitarian leaders and fascist leaders, right? But, I would be curious to actually ask you why you decided to do that in a way. And, what would Hannah Arendt say about the present condition in that sense?
She'd reach for her gun. No. Well, I mean, obviously, I started with violence because of the extreme violence that we're watching today, not in relation to what I'd written, just certainly it is care's nemesis, but I just didn't feel I could speak without talking about that. But you have raised so many other issues, one beginning with the fact that we were criticized by some very crucial, important leading care theorists, although they seem to end up supporting us actually. But they did criticise us. For instance, Bev Skeggs, the hugely important theorist of care in the UK. And as you say, the Women's Budget Group, I'm very friendly with Sue Himmelbeit, who's in the Women's Budget Group, and both of them worrying that by us expanding our notion of care, and particularly, caring for and caring about the world and so on, that, we would weaken the significance of struggles around hands-on care and how bad that was. Nevertheless, we had Bev talking with us, didn't we? And Sue also seems to be partially on side. So what I think is the nature of the world today means we can't just talk about hands-on care and familial care. I mean, we have to extend it to things beyond that. And I think I might have briefly mentioned, but I do, both in the manifesto and my book, talk about the contradictions of care. I mean, I was saying that's why we need public infrastructures of care, because it can be not just difficult work. Perhaps I didn't go on to say it can be dangerous work. You can be doing the wrong things. And it's not just maternal care, it's also in schools and elsewhere. People are doing the wrong things. And so the more we think of care as not just dyadic, but as something that needs community and social support, then the more we get a richer language and practices of care, I think. Loneliness. I did end up saying something about loneliness because I was encouraging, as Hannah Arendt would, of course, our engagement with the world. I mean, she didn't think anyone could be happy unless they were engaged with the world. And I do tend to agree with that, though I don't know that everyone would, and I don't think I could prove it at all, because people might just say, I can be very happy staring at the landscape or producing my artwork and so on. I don't have to engage with the world, and I don't know that I could refute that. But I think Arendt is absolutely right that loneliness and isolation makes people vulnerable to right-wing ideology, and it would have been interesting for me to come back to that and emphasize that at the end, actually. I did seem to be, sometimes I think I'm covering a little too much, and then I realise I'm not even covering enough. So thank you for all those things that are really useful to point out.
Let me abuse presidential prerogative here for a minute. Because of something you just said. You said that you're not sure you could defend the position that loneliness is not an acceptable or indeed a possible position in the world. And here, my take, which comes from a slightly different philosophical position, and which is ontological. I mean, as I tried to say briefly at the beginning, our very existence, what it means to be human, is always both dependent and exposed to the other. And therefore, every conception of ethics, morality, and indeed care, in the first instance, comes out of that ontology, which whatever any neoliberal and any capitalist and any kind of bad guy can say, cannot eliminate that basic other dependence of human existence. To that extent, it seems to me that care, the way you describe it, has a much stronger, I think, foundation and cannot be eliminated. And perhaps one could even argue that politics, solidarity in other words, is an extension and an expansion of that initially dyadic relationship between two faces, a face in need and a face that provides care. And to that extent, it seems to me that one has to be a little more up there, up front, more aggressive. No, if someone claims that they are lonely and that loneliness is a position that somehow can be justified and adopted and pursued and so on, they're either mad, they're either psychically unwell, or they do not understand what it means to be human. Because even if you're alone, on your own, totally sort of watching Netflix, or indeed, as you say, much better looking into the landscape and the sun going up and down and so on, you're still in conversation with yourself. You're still speaking a language, and the language belongs to the other. We always find ourselves in medias res, in the middle of things. And language, the fact that this wonderful structure that allows us to be who we are and to express ourselves and to talk to each other, is precisely something that comes out of that other dependence, and indeed becomes a mark for the fact that all humanity is dependent on the other, and on the concept of alterity, on the fact that someone has come before me, my mother, who called me Costas, and by giving me a name, made me understand who I am, gave me identity. So, in other words, I totally agree with you to cut the point, but I think one can embed your moral and political theory into a stronger ontology, which I think also can then be used to respond and to resist those rather, I think, unhelpful attacks that you were describing as receiving by your colleagues. The great sociologist Birkbeck. Bev is a sociologist, and sociologists are always going to have problems with that kind.
I will try to make a point from an anarchist perspective. As an anarchist, I find very, very useful, very amazing your effort to unite together all this fragmented world, through the term of care. Kropotkin, with his book Mutual Aid, made a great contribution in this direction. Also, we can find Mahayana Buddhism making amazing contributions on the term of interdependence. And I think I propose, like to the people of this room that probably they don't know so many things about Mahayana Buddhism as come from another world, from the other side of the planet, that we don't know so much here, like that Mahayana Buddhism made an amazing contribution about interdependence. So we have a lot of common grounds, like we can speak amazingly all night, like about the idea of care. But I would like, like to speak about optimism, like in the beginning of the talk, like the people applied to you, like as an optimist, like coming from an optimist era. That for me, it is not so much about the optimism; it is about the revolutionary era, about the revolutionary tendency of the era of the 70s, of the 60s, 70s, the era of the people that they were able to imagine the revolution, like to imagine the revolutionary way. Because I think really, like that your thought, it is very useful for preparing the global revolution on the scale, on the chapter of social equality. We cannot have really social equality without interdependence, understanding of the nature of interdependence, and care, like mutual aid, care, But I would like to ask you personally, like now, like after all this era, like after all these years, what you believe about the revolution? Because, like, yes, because, I mean, it is obvious for us, like, especially in Greece, that representative democracy somehow is ending. Because the politicians, they don't really represent the interests of the people, because somehow the global economy is so powerful that the parliament does not govern the country. Even the neoliberal politics, the neoliberal politicians, I don't believe that they really, govern the country, like. It's like the global economy. If you put your thought in the global economy, like, or we're gonna beg the state, or like we will make a revolution. So I think I would like to ask you, like, what is your point about, like, where you imagine the adapt of your thought? Because as an anarchist, I can imagine, like in the social movements, in the street struggle, like in the social struggles, on our way for preparing anarchist revolution, social revolution. But I would like to hear you also, like speaking about revolution.
Okay. I just remember.
How long do we have here?
I remember writing you talk about care washing, your big topic, and we even wrote you something about it together, didn't we? But it was your topic, really. And I suppose it's because I like to ignore the market when I can, to be attacking it and so on. So of course the market's going to undermine our notions of care and, weaken it. And, it's always been the case that the mainstream takes over our concepts. I mean, even, liberation and everything they take over, don't they? And radical and undermine it and revolution, yeah. And that's what they've done. That's what they've done with care. And I really agreed with what you said, Kostas, about there's loneliness and there's solitude, and there's a lot of people writing about solitude at the moment, like my friend Barbara Taylor, and the significance of solitude. And I think loneliness, I mean, Denise Riley once wrote an essay called The Right to be Lonely. That's very Denise Riley. In fact, during COVID, no one was a more frequent visitor to my house than Denise. We would walk over every few days.
So Denise is one of the greatest living poets in the...
But she sort of wants to be able to claim the right to suffer in a way. But at the same time, she very much does want to connect with other people all the time. And I think I've read many things, for instance, by John Burnside, how he wants to escape and enjoy the pleasures of solitude. And he talks about, being on the borders of Norway and so on, and completely alone with the world. And then he'd say, and then he realizes all the support that goes into enabling him to do that, and the people who are going to make sure that he's not lost, and if he is lost, they're going to bring him home again, and so on. So, we are always interconnected. We are always interconnected. And people, I think, feel lonely because they have no sense of agency. No sense of agency at all. And that's why I think some sense of participation in the world, which of course Hannah Arendt absolutely emphasized. She thought you couldn't be a happy person unless you did take, democratic part in life around you. And Arendt is really something of an anarchist, actually, to get to the final one, because she believed in the ideals of the Greek state, that everybody could actually be out there and involved in the demos and determining things together. And that was certainly the beginning of my politics when I was a Sydney libertarian, although then we mainly just knew everything we were against rather than exactly what we might be for. Then as I become a women's liberationist, and then particularly as I age, I think Kropotkin and I'm sure Buddhism, which I know little about, anything that mentions mutual aid and the importance of us looking after each other is crucial. And I am, as almost everyone was, a great admirer of David Graeber, who would be someone I know that you would connect with. And he had the huge optimism to believe that we could just bottom up, create a world of care in which everyone would have their needs met and feel a part of society. I've become a bit less sure about that, particularly as I have grown old, but not only growing old, but I'm so aware of the need for resources. And I'm not sure how bottom up you get those resources. So we could say that Poulantzas did have the right idea in thinking we need a state of some sort to provide the resources to help us look after each other, etc. But of course, that's never going to be adequate. So I would have to mix the optimism of anarchism with some sort of agreement of shared care coming from somewhere that isn't just from the bottom, it comes from the community or the state. But I'm not greatly in favour of the nation state. There can be other ways of trying to organise it, but I don't think it can just come from bottom up because the need for resources is so great. So that's why I would tend towards an libertarian social democracy. Oh, am I revolutionary? Once upon a time, when I was in Big Flame, I was driving along in my little car with my friend Max Farrow, and we picked up some hitchhikers, as one did, and they said, "Oh, what do you do?" And Max said, "We're revolutionaries." And I thought, oh,
Did they try to get out of the car immediately after that?
they were quite impressed. But I was a bit stumped.
I think this is a lovely story upon which to end this wonderful evening. Thank you very much, Lynne. I think Lynne is an endless source of joy, optimism, and even revolutionary fervor in her good days, yes? In the 60s and the 70s. Now she's getting a little more melancholic, but her laughter and her smile, I think, makes all our days. So thank you very much.